Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I am going to be doing more of an informative video comparing hot press watercolor paper to cold press watercolor paper. And today I am using the same brand of paper pad for both of these. They're just different press. So I'm using fluid watercolor paper, not the Fluid 100, which is cotton. And this is a cellulose paper, which means it's made out of tree pulp, and it will absorb less than cotton paper, but it's still a pretty good alternative to cotton paper. So you may be thinking, what is the difference between hot press and cold press watercolor paper? Well, as you can see in the video, hot press paper is much smoother. It doesn't have much of a tooth, and it is less common to be found in art stores, or at least like Michael's and Hobby Lobby. Usually you will find the cold press is sold more often. Hot press also absorbs less water than cold press, but it does have more vibrancy. It creates more vibrancy because it doesn't have the grooves that cold press watercolor paper has. It tends to hold less water, as I said before, but this is also because it's not a 100% cotton paper, and it is more commonly used for showing off brush strokes. So if you're really confident with brush strokes, this is really good paper. Moving on to the cold press paper, it is more textured, and it's the most popular paper that you will find most commonly around. You can find it at Michael's, Hobby Lobby, Dick Blick, and any other art store will usually have cold press watercolor paper. It absorbs more water than hot press watercolor paper, and the pigment settles into the ridges of the paper, so the colors may be a little bit less vibrant, but you can mess around with the water much more than you can on hot press watercolor paper. So as you can see, I am testing out the hot press paper. I did a little Tadashi piece, and you can see that the water is kind of like laying on the top of the paper, and then it kind of absorbs into it. It absorbs differently than the cold press paper, and the pigment is actually much more vibrant on the hot press than the cold press, which I mentioned in the beginning. So that was a really cool little experiment to do. Okay, so overall, this hot press paper is really good for flat washes, like big flat washes. As you can see, there's not a lot of streaks in it, and I actually really enjoyed making this little Yamaguchi last night with this paper. Last time I used it more with a gouache technique, so it was thicker paint and the paper didn't take it as well. Because of that, I believe, since the paint stays on top far longer than it would on a cold press paper, so there's that. And yeah, in conclusion, this paper has little to no tooth or texture on the top. It absorbs the water slower, so you can push it around a little bit more just before it dries. And as I said in the beginning, it's great for bigger flat washes. If you're looking for something that will take a big brush and like not make your paint streaky, I think this paper is pretty good. And as you can see, the results are pretty normal. If you're going to use it with gouache, I would recommend that you try out maybe a sample and see if you actually like hot press paper for gouache. But for watercolor, it's actually pretty good, so I do recommend this paper if you like that. So then I traced Tadashi onto the cold press paper and then I painted him on there. To me, this paper is very natural. It is a little bit more streaky than hot press paper, but since I've been using it for so long, it's just so normal to me. And I use layers, so usually towards the end it won't be as streaky as it is in the beginning. And I think it's more natural for when you're trying to do gradients and stuff like that. As you can see in the beginning of the video, I did a sample to see how pigment would spread on the paper, and you can see that the hot press really just leaves it in one place and the cold press lets it spread out more. So I think this is really good for that, for letting the paper spread the pigment out for you. Ultimately, it comes down to preference. If you like a more painterly style where it's more loose and you get to play around a little bit more, then hot press paper is for you. And if you like your watercolors to kind of be more explosive, and I don't think that's the right word, but more loose, you would probably go for the cold press watercolor paper. I would say try both of them out and see what you really like. Okay, so this is the cold press watercolor paper and how all the washes look. As you can see, the cold press kind of takes things, and in my opinion, it lets the pigments flow more naturally. It just looks more natural than the hot press, but it all comes down to preference, what you like and what you're looking for in a watercolor paper. I would also like to say that this is a cellulose watercolor paper, so it's not cotton or anything fancy, and that might influence the way in which these papers perform. I know that my B watercolor paper performs much different to the Canson watercolor paper, and again, it all just comes down to what you're looking for. This, to me, looks more natural than the hot press. The hot press kind of just lets the pigment sit at one place, like kind of on top. But as you can see, when you're actually working on it, it looks pretty good. Like, these look pretty similar. I believe for me it's much easier to use this paper because I'm just used to it. This is the most common watercolor paper you can find. But in all honesty, I would, if I was a beginner, I would go with the cold press watercolor paper because it has a little bit of texture. It makes your pigments dry a little bit slower than this hot press paper, and it's more easily accessible than a hot press paper. But if you're looking to try a hot press paper, I definitely recommend you do that because it is a different experience to this paper. Although saying that, if you look at these side by side, I think the colors look so much better on the hot press paper than the cold press paper. But I'm thinking that the way that they feel when you're painting is a little bit more important than that. I don't know, I would have to get used to this paper since I've only used it 2 or 3 times in the past 2 months. So it all again comes down to preference, I guess. And I think this is still a good purchase, but that if you're starting out, cold press is the way to go. And that's about all I have to say about these two papers. Let me know in the comments which one you liked most, and like and subscribe if you haven't already. I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out.